Netflix just turned an honest, deceased woman into a fictional serial killer confidant.
I would say that 90% of the new season of Monster is pure fabrication.
Why would we, for decades in a row, be feasting upon this kind of crime?
Denise Warden, this is one of the true victims of Ed Gein, and this is the fucking one where they give him a horny-ass relationship with her.
And in a way, it's very meta, because, of course, we're doing it too when we present it to you again, even if it's in a very self-aware form.
The most authentic and honest version of Ed Gein that's ever been told, which is Ryan Murphy's interpretation of who he was.
The final nail in the coffin for me, when it came to the inappropriate tone, though, was the serial killer Avengers that we had formed right at the end.
We are the monster.
How would you answer who is the monster in the Ed Gein story?
Us by making it.
It makes people look at something like this. It's not right.
You're the one can't look away.
Now, obviously, my mind goes to a few different places with this, and I'd like to address all of them. Now, on face value, like, if you didn't watch the Ed Gein show to know the context of this moment, it's just a comment being made to the character of the actor Anthony Perkins. You're the one who can't look away to mean you have to admit you are interested in this story, and maybe that alone makes it worth telling. And that could just mean specifically the guys who made Psycho were into that. Anthony Perkins was perhaps less into it because he vomited everywhere. But Alfred Hitchcock is a pervert freak. Alfred Hitchcock is, to my understanding, a rapist. So that part I don't really care as much. But then I remember the part where they make Alfred Hitchcock say this.
I wish to change cinema to reflect how we are, not how we wish we were. The polite society burdens us with the fiction that these urges do not exist. This transforms these urges into secrets we must hide, and these secrets make us sick.
Which is really just a perfect recreation of every YouTube comment I've ever gotten defending Dharma or most Ryan Murphy projects. That shows like Dharma and now Ed Gein push the boundaries of dark and provocative content, and in doing so, expose parts of humanity which should be exposed. And that's important.
Ed Gein is a story of what happens when someone is mentally ill and isolated and alone and male.
So actually they just wrote in a fake version of a dead famous director to agree that their show is good.
The most authentic and honest version of Ed Gein that's ever been told.
Now the big thing with the Ed Gein show is that it turns out 90% of it either is not about Ed Gein or about things Ed Gein did not do.
I wouldn't even call it embellishing. I would just call it making shit up.
Wow.
It's more like a heartfelt tribute to the legacy of serial killers. Yeah.
Hello, Ed. I'm also Ed Kemper. I murdered 7 women, 1 girl.
I'm Charles Manson.
Hi, Ed. Jerry Bruno's here.
Richard Speck.
His name is Ted.
This season was actually helmed not by Ryan Murphy, as with previous entries, but now Ian Brennan.
Which is Ryan Murphy's interpretation of who he was.
Who I guess heard claims that Ed Gein suffered from hallucinations through his life, and was like, fuck yeah. Because then he could really depict the tragic deaths of multiple real-life people and their private lives, however the fuck he felt like, because Ed Gein had hallucinations. Guess it was a hallucination. Oh, gotcha, tricked ya. The disappearance of a 14-year-old girl with no evidence of any link to Ed Gein. Fuck it. Extended underwear torture sequence with lurid close-ups on a 25-year-old TikToker. No evidence that Ed Gein ever tortured his victims to begin with. No evidence that Ed Gein ever had sex with the bodies. No evidence that Ed Gein ever killed the victim after having sex with them, or brought kids or a fiancé to the scene of his crimes, or used his mother's corpse to beat people to death, or murdered 2 guys with a chainsaw, or atoned for his sins by partnering with the FBI for a mindhunter to help track down Ted Bundy.
Ed. How do you do?
Nobody cares! Of the episodes, Hunnam said, I never felt we were sensationalizing it. I never felt on set that we did anything gratuitous or for shock impact. It was all in order to try to tell this story as honestly as we could.
When I have a brand new hairdo. Listen to me.
Oh, Eddie!
I don't think that's true, Charlie Hunnam. Is Ed Gein the monster of the show, or is Hitchcock the monster of the show? Or are we the monster of the show because we're watching it? I think the people who act in these shows should really stop talking.
It felt important to be respectful to
the victims, to the victims' families, to try to tell the story as authentically as we could.
I don't feel safe anymore, and that's why today's sponsor for this video is Proton Mail. Proton Mail is a service that provides end-to-end email encryption and tools to help protect you from getting your email or other personal information exposed on the dark web. Proton Mail is an alternative to Gmail and big tech that respects your privacy. It's ad-free and will never scan your emails or target you with ads. The Easy Switch service also makes it extremely easy to transfer emails, calendars, and contacts from old Google or other profiles with a few clicks. And the best part is it was on an episode of Mr. Robot one time. It's also free. And if you'd like to join over 100 million users and get Proton Mail for free, you can just use my link in the description or go to proton.me/JackSaint. Thank you to Proton Mail for sponsoring this video. And thank you.
You know, you need to have certain plot points because he did do these things, but you don't need to embellish them. You know, we get it.
A lot of criticism of the Ed Gein Show has understandably been based on it being charitably a blatant exaggeration of real-life events for shock value, and uncharitably wrapping a complete fiction around the brand name of an infamous double murderer because Netflix sees Ed Gein as basically interchangeable with any other iconic pop culture character. And yes, they definitely would have secured the Fortnite Ed Gein skin promotional tie-in if they thought they could get away with it. Now, I do want to say, I think this show might be the worst thing I've ever watched for this channel.
She killed herself. Oh boy. And do you happen to know where they buried her?
But the single thing I will say in defense of the Ed Gein Show is I do think it's kind of lazy to criticize it solely because it's not a factual depiction of Gein or really any of the many random celebrity cameos. The show is quite bluntly a meta-commentary on the mystique around the Ed Gein story and the ways it was sensationalized in broader culture, more so than anything resembling an actual biography.
Taken your story and twisted it. Used it for their own devices.
Who was the monster? This boy who did terrible things but had been abused and left in isolation with untreated mental health issues, or this legion of filmmakers that took inspiration from his life and sensationalized it for entertainment? We certainly ask that question, and I think hopefully do it fairly responsibly.
In the end, you actually accomplished something.
That's why it so freely misrepresents and fabricates the vast majority of what it depicts.
Eddie, I don't recognize this cut.
It's really less about whether Ed Gein actually did most of the things he does in the show, and more about what people at some point said he did. To use some school parlance, I'm not calling you gay, I'm just telling you someone else called you gay. Actually, it's transness Brennan decided to include as a theme in his Ed Gein Show, specifically so he could make a point about how Ed Gein's version of gender transition is very different from the real, authentic transgenders of his time.
I might be a transsexual.
Ed, I don't think you and I are alike at all.
It's a distinction the show's creators felt was necessary to make, given continuing misinformation about transgender violence. It was really important for us to make that distinction, for us to say, look, these are two very different things, Brennan says, and it was cool to be able to put it in the mouth of Christine Jorgensen. This is kind of like saying Jar Jar Binks is a harmful racial stereotype, and then correcting it by making a Star Wars movie where he has a phone call with Will Smith.
I enjoy being a girl.
Ed Gein was not, and at no point in his life, considered himself transgender. Ed Gein never even cross-dressed, recognizing that cross-dressing is actually quite different from digging up dead bodies to piece together a skin suit so you can inhabit the memory of an abusive dead parent. He didn't call himself trans as stated in the show, never attempted any kind of social transition, and while there are sources suggesting Ed Gein was interested in the story of an actress transitioning, he did not contact her, once again directly labeling himself transgender. Clearly this image of Ed Gein is more rooted in gossip at the time, mostly playing off of rampant scapegoating of gay and trans people as a minority that could easily be demonized to avoid attacking anyone with any real power, which luckily isn't a problem anymore. I mean, this probably is a good time to combat misinformation about transgender violence. I've seen members of the US government literally blame trans people for the rise in mass shootings. I've seen the transgender movement be called the most violent domestic terror threat in the world. And I think if the goal was combating misinformation about transgender people like the showrunner said it was, the obvious thing to do is spend tens of millions of dollars immaculately recreating the most sensationalized trans depiction of Ed Gein ever put to screen, include multiple scenes of Charlie Hunnam in women's clothing while scary music plays, and have him literally call himself trans with the only rebuttal being a different trans person saying, Sorry, did I say that was the obvious thing to do? I meant the opposite of that. I would say that's what you do when you're deliberately trying to play both sides. That maybe Ed Gein was transgender, but you acknowledge some trans people would probably disagree. We may see this pattern a lot in this show.
I have no memory of that.
The obvious thing would be to not portray Ed Gein as a gender-questioning, cross-dressing gynophiliac who murdered women because of his repressed desire to be one. To not directly pander to the exact depictions of Ed Gein you are saying are a problem. To correct misinformation by not spreading more of it. On the other hand, it does mean less scenes of Charlie Hunnam murdering people in lingerie. So I guess the choice was pretty obvious.
Come on, Judge.
The Ed Gein Show actually wants to be woke. It just turns out it's less woke than a movie made 65 years ago.
Why was he dressed like that? He's a transvestite. Not exactly.
This is also what leads the story into several extended tribute acts to iconic cinema, which I thought was a brilliant way to briefly make me think I was watching something better. It's like when a comedian just starts repeating the material of an earlier comedian. It's always a really good sign. We see some of the most significant pieces of art directly influenced by the Ed Gein story, primarily Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with some other references to Silence of the Lambs and Mindhunter. And I do think Mindhunter is clearly the stand-in here for the modern iteration of true crime serial killer prestige media, both because of the obvious visual nods and also because I do agree it's way better than any part of the Monster series. And this then is a context for that line about not being able to look away. Anthony Perkins vomiting about Ed Gein could be seen as a respectable human disgust response, or a reflection of what fake stand-in Hitchcock was saying. Ed Gein's story represents a repression, another side buried under the surface, desperate to burst out with no acceptable release. Psycho was a legitimately subversive film that did shock the audience into a reality cinema at the time rarely depicted. There is a sinister underbelly of violent repression in society that largely ends up victimizing women, and the way it reveals itself can be as shocking and abrupt as Janet Leigh suddenly being killed halfway into her film. So you could say that all we're being told is it was important for Psycho to adapt the crimes of Ed Gein, and the reasons for that are self-evident. Anthony Perkins recognizing a truth being revealed by the Ed Gein story, something for which he can't look away. And maybe even by extension, this Ed Gein show is basically as culturally and artistically important as Hitchcock's Psycho. And I don't think anyone would consider that take objectionable. But I also strongly suspect that this line is an attack on me personally. And that really fucks me off. So please bear with me. Like I say, the Ed Gein story is ultimately less an Ed Gein story and more of a meta-commentary on true crime with an Ed Gein framing device. With that in mind, it's not really a stretch to say Charlie Hunnam staring directly at the screen and announcing, "You're the one who can't look away," is also a direct comment on viewers who may object to this show for some reason. In other words, if you watch the show, you can't really criticize it if you think about it, for even being willing to watch it in the first place. The joke's actually on you because you're the fucked up sex freak and you're a hypocrite, and I bet you're secretly into it. Now personally, I've always loved the defense that if someone doesn't like something, why do they give it a chance to begin with? And honestly, when someone's really attacking something I like, I do find myself thinking that, and then I remember the time doesn't work that way. And you know, it's a lot easier for large numbers of people to not look away from something when it's the most well-funded, widely advertised Netflix production and gets autoplayed after you finish the Is It Cake Halloween special. Then when you consider this comment was originally about Psycho, now that also means criticizing it makes you I guess basically the same as Puritans saying Hitchcock should have been banned. So I understand that effectively a good third of Monster's audience is 13-year-olds that are curious about watching a crazy, fucked up, gory murder show for adults. And to those 13-year-olds or adults who think the same way, criticizing a show for reheating decades-old tabloid gossip to capitalize on the murders of multiple women, up to and including depicting those women as desperate, sex-crazed lovers of Ed Gein, and criticizing a show because it's scary and sinful and has too much blood, it's basically the same thing. To be clear on this point, I don't and have never cared that much about whether a piece of media is gory. I'm a big brave boy and nothing can scare me. I don't even get scared by the big fish from Jak and Daxter anymore. And honestly, even if I were criticizing Ed Gein for being perverse or gratuitous, I think what I'd say would be the opposite. The Ed Gein Show, so desperately lingering on and outright inventing excuses for gory torture and mutilation scenes, isn't really objectionable because it's daring and risky like when Hitchcock made Psycho. It's actually kind of played out. I think that's the most offensive thing to me personally about the Ed Gein Show, that it constantly compares itself to classic films that genuinely push the boundaries of what would be accepted by a sensorial reactionary culture, seemingly unaware it's making its own argument that how it treats its subjects would have barely been interesting, let alone shocking, 40 years ago. Like, yeah, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was also based on rumors around Ed Gein, and it was a huge controversial cinematic event. It also came out in the mid-1970s, and since then we've had Cannibal Holocaust, Sallow, Saw, Hostel, The Human Centipede, and about 1,000 other torture porn movies and TV shows pushing the boundaries of shocking and disturbing popular media. We've actually already hit a point where, I mean, you definitely can still do that kind of thing well, but it's not exactly shocking, and modern horror movies now at least tend to compete on more than just who can physically torture people in the most brutal and bloody ways. I don't think Ian Brennan missed this point in his story. In fact, I know he didn't miss it because we get a scene at the end of Hitchcock discovering his audience is already numb to his shocking noir, and there's a suggestion that maybe he was wrong about how artistically meaningful or important it was in the first place. Maybe it was just more throwaway, consumable shock slop, and all it really did was shift the goalposts of what the average audience member would be excited by.
You knew what your picture would unleash, but you did it anyway. They'll want more and more and more. Like hogs who've tasted blood.
Now look, maybe there's no such thing as meaning or importance, and life itself is an illusion. And unlike the Ed Gein Show, I don't feel comfortable speaking for Alfred Hitchcock, or really find anything comfortable about Alfred Hitchcock. But I did watch Psycho, and I do think there's still an obvious significance to it that goes way beyond how gross or perverse or explicit it was. When the Ed Gein Show recreates the Psycho shower scene, it does it exactly the way you'd think it would, with tons of added shots of gore and boobs, way beyond the original, because I guess that's more shocking and brave. In my opinion, the Psycho shower scene isn't affecting just because of how gruesome or horny it is. It is, as Janet Leigh herself argued, a reminder of vulnerability and defenselessness. In context, it's a scene of a woman who has already found herself constantly pursued by predatory men, first with a customer at the bank and later with a highway patrolman. And in those cases, she had some source of power, access to money or a car. A shower requires stripping down, it's cleansing, it's intimate, and in this case it's also happening at the midpoint of a story which has been dominated by one central protagonist who's been constantly on the run. The audience is also vulnerable to the accepted conventions of a movie like this. There's an assumed safety, much like the assumed safety Lee's character feels, that puts her in that position. But these conservative Hollywood conventions, this veneer of safety from Norman Bates, even the quaint motel disguising the old rotting house lurking behind
There
it,
are plenty of motels in this area. You should have... just to be safe.
all of it was an illusion to be suddenly, violently shattered. That is the unvarnished reality that Psycho reveals, and that, more than any amount of split-second nipple shots or chocolate syrup dripping into a bathtub drain, is the root of its horror. But you know, Ed Gein dug up some vulvas. And that's pretty crazy. That is really the Ed Gein Show in a nutshell. Constant allusions to the ways other artists were able to take these tragic events and use them to create something of weight and impact to the audiences of their time, made so much worse by how often the show directly invites comparisons. As if it really does say something about how vapid and callous and exploitative society is, because the monster team failed to get anything out of this story other than, wow, America sure does love violence. violence. Which, if we're talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre already used the Ed Gein mythology to talk about this 50 years ago. And much like Psycho, and much like Silence of the Lambs, achieved cultural significance without ever needing to directly market their fiction around being the story of real-life Ed Gein and his real-life victims.
Taken your story and twisted it.
And this is the thing, I can totally see someone thinking it's such a clever decision to make an Ed Gein show that really flips a mirror on horror adaptations of the Ed Gein story and the brutal, perverse hearsay that fueled a lot of those ideas. And I'm sure that person is Ian Brennan, and he also thought it was a really clever idea to remake the Psycho scene with extra blood and tits. That's all there is, because frankly, the Ed Gein show is utterly indifferent to anything about the Ed Gein story other than the brutality and the perversion. Psycho told us something about veils of respectability, how polite society pushes a false sense of security, especially from the perspective of women whose concerns and threats to safety are often brushed under the rug. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre covered similar ground while elaborating further on the isolated rural aspect of the Gein story, depicting working class communities falling into deprived ruin, left to inevitably fester, as is still the case in shockingly large chunks of the US. Yes, there is obviously some aspect of titillation and shock value, at least in the initial buzz around these stories, but the shock value is not the only thing.
We're humans, but we're not human anymore.
Monster, the Ed Gein story, only cares about the shock value. And in all its constant fucking tedious diversions into crazy Ed Gein delusional fantasy, it is only that you're reminded of. Obviously, the Ed Gein story is not particularly interested in the plight of forgotten rural communities. Certainly, it doesn't give a fuck about Mary Hogan, Gein's first actual confirmed victim, who is barely a footnote in the story of her own death, aside from a cameo in an Ed Gein Nazi fantasy scene. Even the depiction of Bernice Worden as a horned-up sexual partner of Ed Gein, I can't see as anything but a desperate grab at more shocking content. And when what I'm literally describing is a billion-dollar company financing a fabricated sex scene between beefy Ed Gein and the woman he skinned and decapitated, with a justification that it might be adequate social media rage bait, I hope it makes sense why this whole thing seems sort of fucked. I mean, yeah, they did rage bait me successfully, so that is fair. I fucking hate this. There was really one main reason I refused to look away from the Ed Gein show and actually suffer through the whole thing, and it wasn't really to do with people asking me to cover it. I have a 4-month-old, so I'm basically moments away from only making videos about Peppa Pig and old episodes of Rugrats. I gave it a chance because I already saw a season of Monster that was at least theoretically able to deliver a real, compelling, thought-provoking, not solely sensationalized account of an infamous murder case. And that's roughly 15% of the Menendez brothers season. The Menendez case, wherein 21-year-old Lyle and his 18-year-old brother Eric killed their parents out of apparent fear for their lives following years of emotional and sexual abuse, is in theory the perfect kind of subject this show could meaningfully cover. It invites consideration about the severity of long-time abuse and its psychological effects, about how the experiences of men and boys can be mocked or minimized in these cases. I mean, John Malkovich did an SNL scare openly mocking the testimony where the brothers discuss being molested. With the potential of a high-budget extended series covering this story, that is an opportunity to go beyond the gossip and sensationalism. And Ryan Murphy manages to do that for like maybe an episode and a half? Even Eric Menendez himself, who was disgusted by a lot of what the show chose to depict, was complimentary specifically to the 5th episode of the season. A really surprisingly earnest one-shot performance of Cooper Coke breaking down over the course of an episode as he outlines the torment Eric suffered and the way it destroyed his ability to function in everyday life.
I am not a real person. You can't
are
be.
a real
When the only man you want to love does that to you, you stop being real.
You are real.
Stop saying that.
It presents a complicated reality that maybe we can't just casually dismiss these sociopathic, spoiled rich kids. The severe abuse has an effect and ruins the potential of a simple good and evil narrative. And then follows that up with similarly careful examinations of the parents themselves and what led them to their own behaviors. This is what I think of when I choose to keep looking at these types of media, what I was hoping to see somewhere in the Ed Gein Show, a desire to do anything more thoughtful than just perpetuating the most outlandish gossip around these stories for cheap, mindless titillation. And then the rest of the show happens.
No way.
That is like my right. I feel like a fucking clown.
It's easier to accuse Jose of sexual abuse than to acknowledge the real incestuous relationship.
I get that it's so difficult to, have your life, and not even just your life, but the worst part of your life be televised in a sort of dramatized Hollywood TV version of it. So I just get how difficult that would be, and I stand with him.
There's one major problem in how the Monster series approaches its subjects, and it's an issue here, it's an issue in the Dharma Show, and it's basically the defining quality of the Ed Gein Show. A desperate desire for the show to never have too strong an opinion about anything. Maybe for its own sake, or maybe just because that makes it easier to fit in dramatizing every decades-old rumor or gossip that might generate some WTF Instagram reactions, or perhaps a few memes on Reddit. In Dharma's case, the important part was a running loop of graphic depictions of all the brutal murders he committed, and after that there was maybe some concept of the show being about awareness of, I guess, racism, or childhood bullying, or mental illness, or divorce, or being gay, or porn.
Pornography.
And with the Menendez case, leaving out large swathes of evidence reinforcing Lyle and Eric's account of the abuse that they'd suffered.
From the beginning, I believe Lyle and Eric were victims of their father's abuse. I cannot help but think of how things would be different if the world had known the truth back then.
Instead of being seen as victims, they were vilified. Their father's abuse was dismissed, their trauma ignored, and their truth mocked by millions.
Overplaying their cartoonish American Psycho personalities through most of the season while fabricating scenes that clearly cast aspersions on that abuse.
What is going on with them?
Who the fuck knows? Just let them be.
And fuck it, throw in some fictional incest. Just to really secure that maybe these guys actually don't deserve sympathy or any benefit of the doubt. I think for me it's because there are those moments where it seems so close to presenting a story with an actual perspective and topics worth thinking about, that the whiplash is so much harder when it returns yet again to more trashy, bizarrely sexualized teenage B-movie schlock with no respect for anyone it chooses to depict. Same as the Dharma Show, same as the Ed Gein Show. Fence-sitting on every topic it stumbles into, especially when that topic is child abuse for some reason, while covering the most infamous crimes of 20th century life. And that really is how we get to Ed Gein, a show that has crawled so far up its own arsehole that nothing is left except this grotesque tribute to its own place as the ultimate collection of bullshit narratives around Ed Gein and his victims. Here's a whole episode about how we should really feel sorry for Ed Gein, but also it's another delusion, and also based on traits and experiences Ed Gein didn't have, so who fucking cares? Then, in making sure the show is littered with Wikipedia trivia about Ed Gein's connections to more beloved pop culture, it only highlights how vacuous this entire project really is in comparison, and how little it was ever needed to write and market these shows as true recreations of real-life events. The fact is, they did that because it was one more desperate way to generate some shock value, because its creators lacked the originality to do much more than rerun narratives laid down decades before its release, lacked the spine to use that multi-million-dollar production to really say anything with conviction, and lacked the basic humanity to respect the families of those victimized by these cases. Even while slotting in a half-assed B-plot about a grieving son, because I guess the audience can momentarily care about the identities and lives of these murdered women, as long as it's through the vessel of like a son or a husband or something. Which then, in one final extra cowardly insult, is actually just a segue to introducing a different fabricated evil woman. Adeline Watkins, a real person obviously, but here just as a demonized stand-in for the callous and self-serving true crime fandom Monster has always from the very beginning been reliant on pandering to profit from. You spent massive sums of money making trashy derivative slop that openly mocks and demeans means its victims to an audience of millions. You reduced real-life events to underwear torture scenes and corpse fucking and scandalous cross-dressing and jerking off, and providing, frankly, nothing worth remembering to anyone. This has nothing to do with the audience only caring about twisted, gory, sensationalized fetish material. You are the ones who clearly only care about that, and yet project that back onto not just the viewers who dare look at your show, but far more brave and interesting artists. Because as I understand it, most of that audience wasn't really into this gross, shallow take on this story. But hey, if they didn't look away, I guess that means they're morally culpable for the thing you made. It's actually everyone else's fault that your show is boring and shit. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on that line.